Okay, cool. So hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth webinar of our series. My name is Ravi. I work in the customer success team here at the Information Lab, and I'm joined by my colleague Emma.
Hi there.
So we've been running a bunch of events now virtually. We're using Zoom for all of these. As you'll see, you've got Q&A and chat, so do use Q&A for any questions you want to ask through this period, or in the chat below if you want to chat to everyone else within the webinar. We'll also be recording this, so if you're not, so this will be on YouTube to share afterwards. And finally, if you do want to speak when we do have an interactive session at the end, raise your hand and we can allow you to speak. So you can do that on the panelist side there as well. As I mentioned, we're running a lot of our regular training events virtually, so you can find that on the Meetup group, which is where I'm hoping and assuming all of you guys found this. So this week we've been running a lot of Tableau Prep Builder series with my colleague Carl Alchin, and we've got a bunch of training sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks as well as the final two parts of this series. We're also on YouTube. So as I mentioned, all of the sessions that we're running, the sort of one-off webinar events, along with a lot of other content, is on YouTube. So do check that out as well. We've just recently hit 1 million views. So do check out the different playlists on there as well.
So here's just a reminder of some of the webinars that we've already had in this series. So we've done 4 already. So this is our next one, governance and monitoring. We have 2 more next week. So that's Tuesday and Thursday, all at 2:30 GMT. And again, they will be recorded and available on YouTube afterwards as well. So let's kick off the webinar. So we're first going to just discuss what do we mean by governance.
So governance is sort of, it is really well defined by this circle. So this is taken from Tableau's own website. So they talk about governance in sort of 2 branches. Firstly, the content and then the data. So what do we mean by this? Well, on the data side, that talks about like data source management, the quality of data, monitoring and managing it, as well as making sure that it's governed in terms of security as well as accuracy. And then in terms of content, it's more about who can see how the authorization, access, making sure that content is both discoverable and organized in a more logical way. And a way to organize it would be, this is sort of a sort of example diagram of workbooks and sites in the sort of Tableau infrastructure. You can also replicate this for many other applications. So for example, this server at the top, and then whatever terminology is used with the software you use, this is how to organize it. So we'd almost recommend like considering the way that your organization is organized and sort of mapping that and considering and doing a workshop to understand what is the best way to actually govern content for you.
Yeah, and essentially governance comes down to making sure that you have the right data or the right content to the right people at the right time. And there's a few different models of data and content governance. So I'm going to talk through the 3 that are on the screen. So we're going to talk through centralized, delegated, and self-governed. So centralized would be a very traditional way of looking at data and analytics governance. So centralized would be owned by a particular department or a team. So if you wanted access to data, you have to go directly to that team and ask for the access or ask for the data. Same for asking for analytics. So if you wanted a report on something, you would go to that team, you'd ask for it, they'd do all the analysis for you, and then you'd receive the report. And then if you wanted something changing, you'd go back to them and ask them to change it. Now there's pros and cons to centralized. So the pro of centralized is that you know exactly who's got access to the data, you know exactly who's done the reports for you, you know who those owners are. It's quite clear who those owners are, and you know who you're sending the content and the data out to as well. But some of the cons to that would be that it's quite easy to create a bottleneck. So if you suddenly got a surge in requests You may then have to put all of those into a queue, assess which ones get priority. So you're slowing down access to the data and analytics. So your decision-making processes slow down as well. Delegated is kind of in the middle. It's a bit of a blend. So let's have a look at self-governed. So in a self-governed environment, you're going to, if we're talking about Tableau, then maybe you've got some published data sources on your Tableau server, and anyone can access them. So anyone can have a look at that data and do their own analysis by connecting to it in Tableau. It's completely up to each team or each person, if they're creating analytics, to make sure that it's correct. If they're going to publish anything to the Tableau server, it's up to them to make sure they set their own permissions and give access to the right people. But one of the cons of that is obviously you're going to have some really secure training in place and some monitoring in place to make sure all of those things are being done in the right way, so people are doing the correct analysis and it's being checked, and if they're sharing their content, they know how to share it to the right people and maybe hide it from people that aren't allowed to see it. Delegated might be a little bit in the middle. So delegated, you may still have a central team that does a lot of the business reporting and looking after the data, and there may be some distribution of analytics or data curation to some teams in the business, but not everyone has that access.
So I guess the sort of core overview of the three models is centralized would have almost subject matter experts and application managers, whereas delegated would be almost training up a certain set of champions across the organization, and then self-governed is making sure that everyone has the sort of level playing field to govern their own content.
Yeah, good points.
So why is governance important in itself? Well, I think the first one on our screen is security. Like, I think this is paramount to every single organization, making sure that both the data and the content is secure. This means making sure that the right processes are in place, that the right access and authorization and permissions are set up, both for access to data as well as to content.
Yeah, and part of that security is also like the quality of the data as well. So when you're using data, that it's accurate, that it's up to date, that if you need to join it to other data sets, then you've had the training to be able to do that as well. So enriching your data, joining data together, adding more data sets in for your analysis, they're all part of that quality process as well.
Agreed. And I think that also makes making sure that there's a structure and a plan, like either it being centralized, governed, or delegated or self-governed, means that it avoids a wild west. So there is a process, there is a plan, there is a step-by-step guide where you're almost not allowing people to figure it out by learning by doing, but giving people a sort of a road to follow, like a guide and understanding of what they should do, what they shouldn't do, do's and don'ts, and sort of a basic understanding. And I think that's really important, especially when it comes to administration of any content or any application, making sure that people are aware of exactly what they're doing and the impact of what they're doing and what implications that has on the platform itself, means that it makes it easier to manage and easier to sort of spot errors when things are anomalous in that way as well.
Yeah, and also part of that quality is, if you do have an environment where you've got maybe a test, a pre-prod, a production, that all of your users know that process that they have to go to. So for example, to get onto production, you might have to do certain things. So you might have to have had peer testing to make sure the numbers are correct. You might have to go through a design process to check that you're using visualization best practice in what you're producing as well. So part of that quality is making sure all of those things are in place with like a guidebook or a playbook, and that all of your users know to follow those rules, and also like having things in place to spot things that fall out of those quality guidelines as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that boils down to trust, like making sure that the application is trusted. And I think we talk a bit more about that later on this slide, but that level of trust and understanding of the reasoning behind it, and making sure everyone is educated and understands the reasons behind the processes, and that they're not just there for processes' sake. That's quite important as well. Just have the open communication with your end user.
Yeah, and that also brings in the reduced duplication that we've got on here as well. So things like having published data sources that people, your end users know that they have to go and connect to a published data source, or they should at least check if that data source already exists on the server before they start publishing their own. All things like that are part of your quality process, reduce that duplication. And by reducing that duplication, you're reducing the amount of noise of what's on your server. You're reducing the amount of like resources that your physical server might need to do all of that processing on the same thing. If you've got the 5 different data sources published, but they're all essentially the same data source and they're all being refreshed at like 9 a.m. every morning, then that's going to produce more effort for your Tableau server. It's going to make your environment a little bit slower. So having those checks in place to remove duplication is really important for governance as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure and having that sort of clarity on what is ideal and what you're striving towards means you're able to monitor it in a bit much more effective way, right? So that's where you're able to be more data driven in your decision making, because people are both not only just understand where content is and how to discover new content, but they're also you're then able to act on the sort of trends and the sort of thing people are interested in. This becomes a really nice iterative loop where people are using your platform, be that Tableau, Alteryx, or whatever else, in order to sort of feed that decision making and feed that process of iteration on what's popular and what's not, and sort of try and understand the reasoning behind it. Making sure that the content is consistent is really important, but also making sure that it's organized and in a way that's easy to discover is as important, if not more important.
Yeah, and that all comes down to helping the stability of the platform as well. So if you're reducing that duplication, if you're making sure that your content is structured well, so you can easily access and search for things on a server, your users know where to publish things and they know how to tidy up after themselves. So once something's moved to production, do they go and delete the version that's on test, for example? That all helps with the stability of the platform. And lots of monitoring as well is available, especially for Tableau server and also for Alteryx server. There's tons of monitoring tools out there to help you make sure that your environment is stable. I don't know if you want to go into any of those, Ravi, specifically.
No, I think we've covered it at a really broad level. I think, of course, governance really does depend on the type of business you are and the sort of type of setup you have. Whether you've chosen delegated or self-governed or centralized, all of these do come into play. And I think making sure that you're aware of what sort of things you should be like. This is almost like a checklist, but by no means is it exhaustive. But it raises that awareness and make understanding of exactly what's right and what's wrong and what works for your business. And a lot of the time, you don't really know until you try it, right? And this is where, the journey to self-service analytics or whatever else you're aiming for, it's not a quick win and low-hanging fruit that gets you there. It's stuff like this and having the foundation, as we mentioned. And all of this boils down to making sure that the governance you set in place is trusted. I think it's very easy to lose trust in an application quickly if it's not sort of launched and managed and people aren't directed in the correct manner. I think that's an easy pitfall to fall down. But yeah, making sure that your data, your content is trusted, as well as the way you're approaching data is trusted, is so paramount. Emma, do you have anything to add on the trust element?
So if we think about all the things that we've kind of like just mentioned, so stability of the platform makes your platform trusted. If people are seeing errors when they load things up because the platform is under a lot of stress, it's being overused, then that removes the trust in it, and it also increases frustration. If you've got the same content published 4 or 5 times by different people, showing different things, showing different numbers, then that reduces trust in it as well. So setting up these kind of like governance and guidelines really early on is important in kind of like establishing Tableau or Alteryx as like the tool of choice. That I think that is just the key takeaway from this.
Absolutely. I think on top of that, the first thing someone will do when you show them something new in another application is they'll compare the data they see on screen to their Excel that they have saved locally, no matter if it's out of date or not. This is where we talked about the education community a couple of weeks ago, but that's where that comes in, right? Like you have to help people understand the data literacy and what they're looking at, because ultimately this is the way that they're programmed to think that, the thing they have is more valuable, or at least they can understand it better than anything else. So here are some tips for governance. So as the first one here is setting a clear governance strategy. We've talked a bit about this in detail, but making sure that clarity is not only understood by the application owners and the business intelligence and analyst community, but just about by everyone. Everyone should understand the process, or at least there should be a good place to find why and what is happening in terms of governance for these applications and for data in general. I think that's paramount.
Yeah, I totally agree. If it's all well and good your analysts understanding, the processes they have to go to when they connect to data or publish data and then publish their dashboards and things like that. But also, like, if your users understand the processes that your analysts have to go through to get something published, to get something into production, it helps establish that trust. And that's why our second point is, make it part of your onboarding process. So make it part of that early doors training into, what analytics is at your organization.
Of course, and that doesn't have to limit to people that are new. Onboarding happens at any time, right? And that also includes training existing users on using documentation, being, making sure that their work that they're producing and they're accessing is well documented. And using those documentations and, webinars and things like this, these tools are out there for us to use. And in this environment, where everyone is remote, resources like this become more important. But just a reminder, that people who are already using it might still learn quite a lot in terms of the governance strategies and understanding the processes a bit better. But then making sure that those are then in a place that's discoverable and easy to refer to when people do want to delve into it and want a reminder as well.
Yeah, I think that refresher point is really key as well, because it's quite often in organizations, we see it when working with customers that someone will use Tableau or Alteryx for a few months and then, their project changes or their focus changes and they come back to it, after a break of, a period of time. So having constant webinars or having documentation that people can refresh themselves on is really important. And something that we do discuss with lots of customers is to involve like your risk management or your governance boards that you may have at your organization as well. So for example, if you're a finance organization, it is very likely that you've got a risk management or governance board. And quite often, tools like Tableau and Alteryx can kind of like fall through the cracks of these. And actually recognizing that you might have business critical workflows or business critical dashboards on Alteryx, on Tableau, is really important. And if you start including these on as part of risk management or governance boards, then it's just going to solidify that trust, and it's going to solidify the support for the applications in the organization.
For sure, and that can keep going higher, right? Getting executives involved make sure that that's in place, because those folks will have a different spin on things. And this is where things like steering committees, governance boards, and risk management all come into play, because whilst, and as an end user and application owner, you might find that the tool you're using, it does have inbuilt governance processes. Making sure that work with the company's own internal policies makes sense as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so many organizations now have like a data strategy or an analytics strategy as part of their mission statement or executive statement. So you're seeing a lot more like chief data officers, chief technology officers getting involved in this sort of stuff and this thinking around governance and security and things like that as well. And the last one we've got on the list here is like setting up monitoring and alerts. There's lots of different ways that you can monitor a Tableau server environment or an Alteryx server environment to get reporting on usage, but also get reporting of data downloads and who's accessing what, and whether a service is about to fall over or not. There's a lot of stuff out there to help you get regular monitoring on the status of those things as well.
Absolutely. And once you have those elements put into play, like you're able to really actively monitor and make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks as well. So here are a couple of resources we've got on. So Tableau has a data management add-on and a data catalog that can help you with governance and governance strategies. And the second one there is Project Griffin. This is something that I've been leading as part of the Information Lab team to build out some custom Tableau server admin views that you can use to easily download.
Yep, we've got a link to Alteryx Connect. So for those of you interested in data management, cataloging data, making data dictionaries, defining owners and lineage of data is really important at the moment. So Alteryx Connect is another tool that lets you do that. It lets you connect to like lots of different databases that might be in your organization, as well as your Alteryx server and Tableau server, to see how all these things link together.
For sure. Go on.
So we've also been looking at Tableau's data trends. So they do have lots of information on, so if you just Google Tableau data trends, like governance is one of those. So you can have a look at some of the links that Tableau have on that as well.
And then finally, I think, Emma, you've been leading a series on governance where we've spoken to customers that we have about what they're doing in terms of governance and sort of procedures they've set up as well in place.
Yeah, some really good interviews there with different people from different organizations about how they govern Tableau and Alteryx.
So over to you. What governance practices and sort of this open Q&A, you can sort of chip in and give your sort of two takes, and we can answer some questions as well. But at your organization, what governance practices do you have in terms of monitoring as well as governance? I thought there was a couple of questions coming through there, Emma.
Yeah, so I'm kind of monitoring the chat and the Q&A. If you can use the Q&A, that's much easier because I can mark it as answered. We do have one from Chris that came in first on chat, and it says, do you have any examples of monitoring and alerts in practice from the real world? So yes, lots. So underneath Alteryx server and underneath Tableau server, there are vast repositories of information. So basically every time someone clicks on something, it's usually recorded somewhere. And Ravi has already mentioned his Project Griffin, but there's lots of community-based dashboards you could have a search on, like the Tableau public, but Project Griffin's a great one. If you put like Project Griffin Tableau into Google, it'll come up with a bunch of curated admin dashboards that help you monitor lots of things on your Tableau server.
In terms of practical examples, I was working with a customer actually just not yesterday, day before yesterday, and what we were working on is exactly that, setting up monitoring and alerts in practice. What we've ended up doing is using Tableau's community data sources. So this is on Tableau's own GitHub page. They have some curated data sources made by a chap named Matt Coles, who's fantastic. Like you should only be using the resources he creates in terms of Tableau data sources. But what we've ended up doing is publishing those into a separate site that only server admins can see, and then setting up data-driven alerts to see if it beats this threshold, send me an email, sending subscriptions on things that they're monitoring, such as stale content as well. But if you want to pick this up, like I'm always happy to chat, and I'm sure Emma is as well, in terms of monitoring and how to set those up in a practical way.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the next question. So we've got one from Jeffrey. Ideally for Tableau, you'd like to utilize server data sources, but if you have embedded data sources in workbooks, does it make sense to monitor those workbooks for usage to perhaps revisit publishing those data sources? What do you think on that one, Ravi?
100% yes. Like I think if you're seeing the same data source being connected to, be that a SQL table, an Oracle data source, or even a Google, like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc, that's a really good indication of, let's actually curate this, make sure that we've got everything that everyone's using, and then publish that as a separate data source. If only just for some centralization and having that governance piece in place, but also just to consolidate, and not make sure that work isn't duplicated. This is a process I went through with one customer where we sat down and did a workshop. We found the top 5 workbooks and the data sources used. And then we set about doing a project where we're consolidating like the different tables together to see if we can make one data source, or what we ended up doing is making 3, because they had different levels of granularity and had different purposes.
Yeah, great points there. And I'd just like to point out that myself and another colleague, Andre, did a webinar earlier this week on Tuesday about data management, and we talk about this in that webinar as well. It should go up on YouTube soon if it's not all there on there already, so maybe have a look on there for that one as well. So let's move on to the next one. So Alex Stevenson says, you're preaching to the converted, which is good. Just wonder, is it possible to quantify the benefits of good governance? For example, 10 to 20% less support resource needed.
Oh, that's a great question. Possibly. I think that the thing you might, the easier way of doing it is seeing an uptick in, for content, let's start with content. I think for content, the good way of finding out is seeing an uptick in people discovering new content. You might have a problem where people just sort of, the best way people are accessing Tableau Server or Alteryx is with a link. But if you're getting people to actually explore because it's an easier discovery process, that might be different. Do you have any thoughts on data and how to monitor data, sort of quantifying the impact of data governance?
Yeah, so the support resources is a great one. You know, if you've got great governance and people are able to find what they need more on the server because it's all organized nicely and they've got access to the right stuff that they need, then yes, you might see a reduction in like the number of questions that are being sent to your team that's supporting it. So that's a great thing to track. I mean, key things that we should always be tracking is like usage of Tableau Server, Alteryx Server, which you can get from the repository. So just tracking your usage is really important. If your platform is trusted because it's governed well, then that usage is going to grow over time, hopefully. Mm-hmm. You could also have a look at the amount of content that is on there as well. So some organizations think, you know, having thousands of workbooks and thousands of data sources is great. And that might be necessary, but what you might find is, you know, if you monitor your Tableau Server environment or your Alteryx Server environment really well, actually you can cut down a lot of content. So some companies have in place, you know, they monitor for stale content that hasn't been used in 90 days. And if it hasn't been used in 90 days, it's then just deleted, it's just removed. So you could think about doing stuff like that as well. So, you know, monitoring that stale content that isn't being used, removing stuff to keep your server nice and healthy as well.
I think my final point on that is this is where documentation comes in quite nicely. So making sure that things are well documented and it's easy to find and as a resource to point to and use as a reference. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good one. So what Nico, our organization is currently in digital transformation in terms of database management, network monitoring, and dashboard analytics. What is your suggestion to have smooth process while the transition is going on, so the operation, I guess, won't be affected?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a tricky one because while that is going on, you really want to educate people. Maybe that's a good place to start and use that time to say, hey, we're doing this process. What are your thoughts on what went wrong in the old regime and how do we make it better for you, and what the sort of common problems you see, and then use those interviews and almost chats you have with folks to sort of shape that, you know, because every single department, everyone has an opinion, right? And everyone's going to have a different approach to how they'd like to see things governed and the access distributed. I think that's a good place to start. Alongside that, I think making sure that you're prioritizing the first things you put online once the transformation is complete, and then using that as a time to improve and consolidate that thought as well. That's my top thoughts. Emma, I don't know what you think.
I mean, this is all coming down to kind of change management, I guess. So, especially if you're talking about like changes to databases and networks, I'm assuming that you've got existing databases with connections to, and they're going into like a new environment. You might, for example, if you've got like Tableau dashboards connected to those, you're going to have to think about contacting the owners of those that are going to be affected and saying, you know, can we download this? Can we try connecting it to the new infrastructure? Can we test that it's working? You know, figure out if any changes need to be made and then like republished. So like Ravi said, you know, reaching out to the owners of your content, reaching out to the users, having really good communication about what is happening and why these changes are being made is really important to, first of all, just make sure nothing's going to be missed, like nothing's going to be forgotten and suddenly, you know, fall apart or go down. And use that time to educate on what's coming next and, using that communication to get users to test stuff out as it's being changed as well. I think that's really important. Okay, so let's go on. So we've got Alex Stevenson. Many mature organizations have multiple BI and analytics tools in addition to Tableau.
Mm-hmm.
How straightforward is it to apply governance strategy to legacy and alternative tools that may be used by the same communities?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think that there's a lot of concepts that we've talked about today that are transferable. But in case of sort of modern BI tools, you've given a lot more of those tools built in to do governance and monitoring tasks. I think that's the thing that you might find a bit tricky. I think you still can get some sort of information, like you can use sort of IT monitoring tools, things like I think there's a Perfmon, something like Perfmon, to understand what's going on with the backend processes in terms of that sort of governance. But yeah, I think that's a really tricky one to answer. I think the best answer I can give is taking the sort of the applications you've seen that we've talked about today and sort of trying to relate them back to those in the best way possible. I think that's my best advice. I don't know if you have something better, Emma.
Yeah, no, I think what we talk about, documenting how users connect to data, it may be different in different tools, but make sure it's documented. Make sure you document the testing process. So do things have to be published to test and then go through a certification process to make them into production? Make sure that process is the same for all of the different tools that you're using, and you've got documentation to back all of that up. Like Ravi was saying, monitoring of the different tools, every tool is going to be monitored in slightly different ways, but making sure that's all there. And it's all about that communication again. So communicating well to your users, this is the governance that you have to follow, or if, they're end users, this is, the governance that is put in place so you can trust these services. It's just going to be, slightly different for all of the different tools that you're using. Slightly harder job, unfortunately. We have kind of overrun a little bit, so we will just carry on with the questions. So if you'd like to stay on, then please do. So we've got one question up here. So what's your definition of governance? So I think if we'll probably go back through the slides just to bring that up.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially it was, the right data, the right content to the right people at the right time.
Exactly, and as we said, we split it. We really like this the wheel of governance from Tableau themselves. So the sort of split between data and content, and then within that, what does come under the governance. But yeah, I can appreciate there are certain elements of this wheel that are more important to some organisations than others. So as the saying goes, your mileage may vary.
Cool. Right, I'll mark that one as done. So I think that this is going to be the last question. So do you have a preferred data governance framework?
Mine's delegated, I think. I really like the idea of having champions in each organization that almost are, in the nicest possible way, like hall monitors, like people that are checking, being your people on the ground, so that it's not bottlenecked by a centralized BI team and you're not having to trust and onboard so many people. That's my preferred method. But I think education, the whole adage of governance starts with you, like that sort of thing, like everyone has their role to play. But having that delegated process, I think works best in my opinion. I don't know what you think, Emma.
Yeah, agreed. I think delegated works for the majority of companies, because you're likely to already have that maybe central team that's historically looked after your data, looked after your analytics. But becoming more delegated does stop that bottleneck, and I'm sure there's lots of people in the organization that are data savvy as well, that are business analysts or just interested, generally in answering their own questions. So I think that delegated model can work. I mean, self-governed is like always like the idealized thing to get to, but it is very difficult to get to that without a lot of kind of like education, training, and from leadership. It has to be pushed from leadership as well.
Cool.
Okay, so I think that's all of the questions, so we can start wrapping up. So
Yeah. So we've got 2 more sessions in this series to go. The first of which will be on Tuesday, where I'll be talking about automation and AI. And then join myself and Emma again next week to talk about agility with data. As I mentioned, all of these will be on YouTube, so do share them with your colleagues. Join our meetup group for any other training and event sort of purposes that you might find useful. And if you do have any suggestions on events we can run, do let us know. So we are always looking out for how we can help with that sort of thing as well. But with
That's
that,
great.
thank you to everyone, and everyone have a great weekend, and we'll speak to you next week.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thank you.